On the morning of Sunday, July 23, 1967, Detroit police raided an after-hours bar on 12th Street where a party for returning Vietnam veterans was being held. A crowd gathered, a bottle was thrown, and within hours, a city that had been quietly burning with decades of frustration erupted into 5 days of fire. 43 people died, more than 400 buildings were destroyed, and the music industry that had made Detroit one of the most important cities in American popular culture was never the same again. Number 10. Fortune Records. Fortune Records occupied a modest storefront at 11629 Linwood Avenue in Detroit, a family-run independent label operated by Jack and Devorah Brown from 1946 until its eventual collapse in the mid-1990s.
She has gone.
The studio was located behind the record shop, an 18 by 40-foot room with a dirt floor that had been converted to wood as the operation grew. The recording equipment was rudimentary by the standards of even small independent labels of the era. The music Fortune recorded was extraordinary.
As she lay warm and tender.
Nolan Strong and the Diablos recorded The Wind for Fortune in 1954, a floating, almost ethereal piece of doo-wop built on Strong's impossibly pure falsetto that became not just Fortune's signature recording, but one of the most important pre-Motown Detroit recordings in existence.
And when the summer's rich colors are shimmering across.
A 13-year-old boy named Smokey Robinson heard The Wind on the radio and decided it represented everything he wanted his voice to be. The Diablos are why Smokey Robinson sings the way he sings. Fortune Records sat in the heart of a neighborhood that the 1967 Uprising fundamentally transformed. As Nidit's Curiosity documented in 2025, citing historian Kim Hurt, after the rebellion and the mass exodus that followed it, the neighborhood surrounding Fortune's Linwood Avenue storefront was permanently changed.
I remember sweet kiss.
The community that had sustained the label, the customers who walked into the record shop, the artists who came through the neighborhood, the infrastructure of a living black musical district, was dispersed by the combination of the uprising, white flight, and the general economic collapse of Detroit's inner-city neighborhoods in the years that followed.
When I see lovers making love.
Fortune sputtered toward its end after 1967, releasing its last record in 1972. Jack and Devorah Brown were struck by a car while crossing the street in 1973, an accident that left Jack permanently injured and eventually killed him in 1980.
Then, how long for you?
The building was eventually demolished on Devil's Night, October 27, 2001. The label that had housed Nolan Strong, the man who influenced Smokey Robinson, was erased from the landscape of a city that was still paying the costs of that July in 1967.
I know she has.
Number 9. Sidra Records. Sidra Records was one of the smaller independent labels operating in the Detroit Highland Park area in the mid-1960s, run by a figure named d'Orleans, who had previously worked within the Golden World orbit before that label's sale to Motown left him without a position. The label operated out of Highland Park, the small independent city, geographically surrounded by Detroit, that had its own distinct character within the broader Detroit music scene. Barbara Mercer's So Real and Call on Me were among Sidra's most notable releases, recordings that have subsequently attracted the attention of soul collectors and Northern soul enthusiasts, who recognized in them the quality of the best Detroit independent label releases of the period. They had the production sophistication and the vocal intensity that the Detroit soul scene at its mid-1960s peak was capable of generating, produced outside the Motown machine by people who had learned their craft working alongside it. What the D-Business magazine documentation of the Golden World story makes clear is the specific geography of destruction.
My life is real.
Highland Park, where Sidra operated, was directly connected to the 12th Street neighborhood at the epicenter of the uprising, and the mass exodus of residents and businesses from inner Detroit neighborhoods that followed July 1967 was as devastating to small independent labels as any physical destruction could have been.
Was it just a scheme to put me on a stream, darling, please?
A record label's viability depends on its community, on the local infrastructure of musicians, studios, pressing plants, distributors, and audiences that allows it to function.
Don't you know it's real, boy?
The 1967 uprising and the years of neighborhood depopulation that followed dismantled that infrastructure across the inner Detroit neighborhoods where independent labels like Sidra had been operating.
And if you really care for...
Barbara Mercer and her records are now sought after by collectors. The label that released them could not survive what happened to the community it came from. Number 8. Harvey Tri-Phi Records. Harvey Fuqua, lead singer of the Moonglows, one of the foundational vocal groups of early rock and roll, built his own Detroit record label empire in the early 1960s around two imprints, Harvey Records and Tri-Phi Records. He brought extraordinary talent to both. The Spinners recorded for Tri-Phi. Junior Walker and the All-Stars recorded for Harvey, and a young singer from Washington, D.C. named Marvin Gaye, who had come to Detroit in the late 1950s as a session musician and backup singer, recorded Stubborn Kind of Fellow for the Harvey imprint in 1962. The song is the first Marvin Gaye recording that sounds fully, unmistakably like Marvin Gaye. The combination of his gospel-rooted vocal power with the driving, up-tempo arrangement that future funk brother and Harvey session player Joe Hunter built around it produced a record that hit number 8 on the R&B chart. But here is where the story takes a turn that defines the entire pre-uprising Detroit soul landscape. Berry Gordy saw what Fuqua had at Harvey and Tri-Phi, and in 1963, Gordy purchased both labels and absorbed their entire rosters into the Motown system. The Spinners came to Motown. Junior Walker came to Motown. Marvin Gaye came to Motown. Harvey Fuqua himself came to Motown as a producer. The consolidation of Detroit's independent soul infrastructure under Gordy's control that had been happening gradually throughout the early 1960s meant that by the time the uprising arrived in 1967, Motown had eliminated most of its significant local competition. Harvey and Tri-Phi no longer existed as independent entities. Their artists were Motown artists. Their legacy was now Motown's legacy. The uprising that silenced Motown in July 1967 was silencing the heir to everything Harvey Fuqua had built. If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 7. Revilot Records. J.J. Barnes is one of the most critically respected and commercially underserved figures in the entire history of Detroit soul. He recorded for multiple Detroit independent labels throughout the 1960s, Ric-Tic, Mickey's Records, and Revilot Records among them, producing a body of work that soul collectors, DJs, and music historians consistently describe as equal in quality to the best Motown recordings of the era, delivered without any of Motown's promotional infrastructure. Please Let Me In, recorded for Revilot in 1967, exemplifies everything Barnes represented: the production quality, the vocal performance, the hook. All of it operates at the level of the best uptown soul of the period. Richard Popcorn Wiley, one of the most gifted producers working outside the Motown system, brought the same craft to Barnes's Revilot sessions that the Funk Brothers brought to Hitsville, with results that the Northern Soul scene in Britain would eventually recognize as some of the most important recordings to come out of Detroit. But Barnes was the artist most directly affected by Motown's aggressive absorption of Detroit's independent label landscape. Each time he found a label that could support his work, Gordy's commercial dominance and the post-Riot economic disruption of Detroit's music scene combined to undermine it. Revilot collapsed. Barnes moved to Britain, where the Northern Soul circuit gave him audiences willing to pay attention. The story of J.J. Barnes is the story of Detroit Soul's independent ecosystem, the labels that should have flourished alongside Motown, that had the talent and the music to justify their existence, but were squeezed out by consolidation before the uprising and then dispersed by the neighborhood collapse that followed it. He died in 2023, largely unrecognized in mainstream American music history. Number 6, Golden World Records. Ed Wingate built Golden World Records into the most significant competitor Motown had ever faced in its own city. He did it by signing the talent that Gordy's machine had overlooked or discarded: Edwin, Starr, J.J. Barnes, the Fantastic Four, the Parliaments featuring George Clinton, Laura Lee, the Reflections. He hired the Funk Brothers to play on his sessions under a pseudonym, called them the San Remo Golden Strings, and produced recordings that were so close in quality to Motown's output that Gordy was reportedly furious.
You've been so sweet to me. That's what he's...
Darrell Banks recorded "Open the Door to Your Heart" for Revilot, connected to the Golden World orbit in 1966.
A little too long.
It hit number 7 on the R&B chart and became one of the defining recordings of mid-1960s Detroit soul, produced with the lush, orchestrated sophistication that characterized the best work coming out of Detroit's independent scene. Banks had a voice of extraordinary range and conviction, and the record demonstrated what Detroit's non-Motown soul infrastructure was capable of producing.
Let it shine like the light.
Then came July 1967, and the connection between Ed Wingate and the Uprising is not abstract. Wingate and his business partner Ernest Mackey co-owned the Algiers Motel on Woodward Avenue.
Take all my blind soul, babe.
On the night of July 25th and into the early hours of July 26, 1967, 3 young black men, Aubrey Pollard, Fred Temple, and Carl Cooper, were killed at the Algiers Motel by Detroit police officers during the uprising, in what became known as the Algiers Motel incident.
You've been so sweet to me. That's what keeps my...
The officers were tried. They were acquitted. John Hersey wrote a book about it. The case became one of the most documented and debated episodes of the entire uprising. Ed Wingate's motel was the site of 3 murders by law enforcement during a riot in his own city. He sold Golden World to Berry Gordy. Darrell Banks, the voice of "Open the Door to Your Heart," lost his label connection and eventually lost his life. He was shot and killed in 1970 at 32 years old over a dispute involving a woman. Golden World Records was gone. The Algiers Motel was gone. Detroit's most credible Motown alternative had been consumed. Number 5, Ric-Tic Records. Ric-Tic Records was the subsidiary label of Ed Wingate's Golden World operation, and it was Ric-Tic that produced the record that made Berry Gordy decide he had to buy Wingate out entirely. Agent 00 Soul by Edwin Starr, a James Bond-inspired piece of Detroit funk that hit number 21 on the pop chart and number 8 on the R&B chart in 1965, was recorded at the Golden World studio with Funk Brothers musicians who had traveled a short distance across Detroit to play a session for Wingate under the name the San Remo Golden Strings. When Gordy discovered that his own session musicians were moonlighting on a competitor's records and producing something this close in quality and commercial appeal to Motown's output, he fined each of the Funk brothers $1,000 and began the process of buying Wingate out. Gordy paid approximately $2 million for the Golden World catalog, the studio, and the Ric-Tic label in 1966. The Golden World studio became Motown's Studio B. Edwin Starr came to Motown. But the other artists on Ric-Tic, J.J. Barnes, the Fantastic Four, the Parliaments, were largely left without support, their contracts absorbed into a system that had no particular interest in developing them. The full sale of the Ric-Tic catalog was completed in 1968, in the year after the Uprising. Wingate, shaken by what had happened at the Algiers Motel, was no longer in a position to fight for his music industry empire. The Ric-Tic artists, who had been the most credible alternative to Motown's dominance, found themselves either absorbed into the Motown machine or abandoned at the exact moment when Detroit's independent music infrastructure was most vulnerable. Edwin Starr's story at Motown is itself instructive. Gordy didn't know what to do with him for years. He was a second-string act, until Norman Whitfield gave him War in 1970, and Starr took it to #1. The label that had made him a star was gone. He finally got his moment at the label that had bought his career. Number 4. Motown Records. On the morning of July 23, 1967, employees of Motown Records arrived at Hitsville USA on West Grand Boulevard to begin the recording sessions that had sustained the label's output through years of continuous, almost uninterrupted production. Berry Gordy met them at the door. He told them to go home. They were putting their lives in danger. The studio was closing. It was the first time in years that the Motown recording machine had gone completely silent. 8 Motown singles were on the Billboard Hot 100 that week, including 2 in the top 20. The label that called itself The Sound of Young America was, for 5 days, the sound of nothing. Martha Reeves was one of those employees who tried to come to work. She had been at Motown since she was a secretary, before her voice had taken her from the phone to the microphone. Dancing in the Street, written by Marvin Gaye, Mickey Stevenson, and Ivy Jo Hunter, and recorded in 1964, had become something much larger than a dance song by 1967. Civil rights activists had adopted it as an anthem, hearing in its joyful invitation to take to the streets something that resonated with the moment in American history they were living through. Martha Reeves herself has said she found it bittersweet that a song about dancing in the street was playing on the radio while the streets of her city burned. She would go on to serve as a Detroit City Councilwoman, bringing a direct connection between Motown's musical legacy and Detroit's political life that the Uprising had accelerated. The silence at Hitsville, USA in July 1967 was the beginning of a longer silence. Within 5 years, Berry Gordy would be planning Motown's move to Los Angeles, completing the departure from the city that had made everything possible. Number 3. Motown Records. Reflections was released in late July 1967, directly into the aftermath of the Detroit Uprising. The Supremes' 12th #1 hit, produced by Holland Dozier Holland, features a drone synthesizer opening that was unprecedented in Motown's production catalog, a sound that critic Stuart Cosgrove, in his book Detroit '67, The Year That Changed Soul, identifies as deliberate and meaningful. It sounds like a city on edge. It sounds like something has changed.
From the hurt that you
The song's lyrics describe seeing yourself reflected in a lover's eyes, but the sonic atmosphere around those lyrics in 1967, released from a studio that had just gone silent for 5 days while the city outside it burned, carried a weight that its production context could not escape. Reflections peaked at number 2 on the Hot 100. It was held off the top spot by Ode to Billy Joe by Bobby Gentry. Holland Dozier Holland, the writing and production team whose output had defined Motown's commercial peak, would leave the label in 1968, just over a year after Reflections was recorded.
no love to shield me, trapped in a world that
Their departure, partly motivated by financial disputes with Gordy over royalties, represented the most significant internal rupture in Motown's history and began the process of gradual commercial decline that the Uprising had accelerated by disrupting the label's operations and its community.
reflects the hurt I can't control.
Berry Gordy's response to the Uprising, turning away his employees, watching the city he had built his empire in, consumed by fire and conflict, changed something in his relationship to Detroit.
Took from me and left me alone.
The sound of young America was reconsidering its geography. Los Angeles was beginning to call.
Of lost time, looking over my
Number 2, Strata Records. Kenny Cox was a Detroit jazz pianist who had recorded 2 albums for Blue Note Records in 1968 and 1969. He was also a man who had watched his city burn in 1967 and then burn again in 1968 following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and who had decided that music and community were inseparable responses to what had happened. In 1969, Cox founded Strata Records, but calling it a record label first is not quite accurate. Strata was a community organization first. It ran food drives, it ran jazz programs for local residents in the neighborhoods that the uprisings had devastated. It created a coffee shop and a live music venue, and a recording studio in a city that was hemorrhaging residents and businesses and the infrastructure of cultural life. Barbara Cox, Kenny's widow, has been clear in interviews. The people of Detroit don't call it the riot, they call it the insurrection. And Strata was the musical insurrection's answer to itself. The label released fewer than 10 albums between 1969 and 1975, operating on what the Vinyl Factory described as a shoestring budget. The iconic minimalist black and white artwork that graces every Strata release was chosen specifically because it reduced printing costs. Albums sat unreleased on studio tapes for years because the label ran out of money. The Lyman Woodard Organization's Saturday Night Special, a sprawling, free-spirited piece of Detroit funk jazz that Brooklyn DJ Amir Abdullah discovered decades later and used as the starting point for a full reissue project, represents what Strata was at its most powerful: a community of musicians making music in the rubble of their city, answering devastation with creation. Strata was not destroyed by the uprising, it was built from it. Number 1. Tribe Records. If Strata was Detroit's post-riot jazz response, Tribe Records was its political one. Founded in 1971 by trombonist Phil Ranelin and saxophonist Wendell Harrison, 2 years after Strata, in the 3rd year after the city had burned, Tribe operated explicitly within the Black Power movement's cultural philosophy. Its releases carried political content. Its cover art was designed around Black liberation aesthetics. Its music was jazz and funk and soul fused with an urgency that came directly from living in a city that had been left in ruins by state violence and institutional abandonment. Phil Ranolin's Vibes from the Tribe, released in 1972 on the label's own imprint, is a document of what Detroit sounded like 5 years after the uprising, a city still processing the trauma, still finding its musical voice in the aftermath of devastation. The album's title is a statement of purpose. We are still here. We still have a tribe. The tribe still has music. And the music is evidence that the city did not end in July 1967. Tribe, like Strata, operated on almost no money. It released 13 albums across its brief run, all of them now collector's items. The label closed when the money ran out, as community labels with no corporate backing inevitably do. Harrison and Ranolin continued as musicians and educators. The music they made in Detroit's post-riot ruins has been rediscovered by successive generations of jazz and funk collectors who recognize in it one of the most honest documents of what American urban devastation sounds like when artists refuse to be silent about it. The 1967 uprising silenced Motown for 5 days and accelerated its departure from Detroit. It contributed to the collapse of Fortune Records and the displacement of Sidra. It provided the traumatic context for Golden World's sale and Ric-Tic's absorption. It killed 3 men at the Algiers Motel, one of whom was co-owned by the man who ran Detroit's most credible alternative to Motown. And then, from its ashes, Strata and Tribe rose, 2 community labels that used music the way the uprising itself had used fire, as an act of refusal, as a declaration that something essential remained.